Coming up on Bridge City News, we talk to recipients of the new Alberta Northern Lights volunteer program. The Alberta government is predicting a record-breaking year in an industry that means so much to Albertans. And one Lethbridge woman shares her experience with chronic pain.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Thank you for joining us. The government of Alberta is formally recognizing the volunteer work being done by Albertans. Several people were nominated for the Alberta Northern Lights Volunteer Recognition Program, including a local woman in Lethbridge.
I'm absolutely beyond honored because it took a community. It wasn't just me, it was our whole community of Lethbridge for the people who stepped up to help families, individuals, and children through COVID. I'm born and raised in Lethbridge, and I have an extreme love for our community and every single person in our community. And of course, there was some malicious backlash. There was bullying and slander and hate. And so what I did with that was it actually fueled me to keep going and to allow my light to shine through this, to be supported by others who love Lethbridge and every single human being in this community. And that's why we're here, because we've stood together to connect the community of Lethbridge and assist those who might need some extra resources through COVID.
Mallory came to my house after I had some health issues. I spent some time in ICU. She showed up at my house with an Easter dinner, completely cooked, all packaged up, ready to go, treats for my grandkids. Mr. Kenny, you picked the right person for this award. She is the most deserving person I know, the most deserving person in Lethbridge, for sure, hands down. No one else in Lethbridge deserves it more.
The Alberta Northern Lights Volunteer Program honors those who best demonstrate community spirit, serve as a role model, and contribute unpaid service through volunteering. The Feed Lethbridge fundraising event turned out to be a huge success this year. The numbers are in, and over $25,000 were raised, with every cent going to support the Interfaith and the Lethbridge food banks.
So fundraising is a core part of what we do as a nonprofit organization, and the funds that are raised from this event are going to go directly into our programs and services, emergency food hampers, cooking classes, garden programs, anything we're offering the community. You know, we were pleasantly surprised. This was our first time doing this type of an event, and so we had no idea how well the community would respond to it. We were very fortunate to have sold out of our meals. We also had great bids on our auction items, and even our 50-50 did well.
According to stats taken from the Interfaith Food Bank website, they serve an average of 935 adults and 603 children each month, so donations are needed year-round. A group called the Citizens for a Better Coaldale is making an appeal to the town of Coaldale. Concerns arise from an apparent lack of transparency on big projects the town is undertaking, including the Civic Square project, recreation center, and a new school. The group is now calling for a municipal inspection to be done on the town. The Citizens for a Better Coaldale met at Town Council this week and is hoping to start a petition where they would need 20% of community support to force a municipal inspection.
As far as public participation on the site location for the rec center and the school, there was none. The town made the decision for us without even involving the citizens of Coaldale. The Civic Square project that's behind me, that's going to be supposedly happening in 2021. It's the largest project in the history of Coaldale for its main street.
I have no issue with the municipal inspection itself, but at our last council meeting when Jack Van Ryan presented, the biggest thing to me that kind of made me step back on it is that he said the school would be paused. So we have a proposed school and we're hoping to get funding soon for it. We're Palliser Regional School's #1 choice for projects that they need to get done. So putting a pause on this project could actually cause us to lose that first place, maybe even the second place and the third. So I would rather them come with concrete reasons for the inspection and us hire people out to help us, figure those out.
Many people talk about the oil and gas sector being the backbone of Alberta's economy. However, Alberta's agriculture sector has been thriving for many Albertans even during the pandemic. As Ainsley O'Reilly explains, the Alberta government is predicting a record-breaking year in an industry that means so much to Albertans.
Stats Canada says 11.5% of Albertans are unemployed. However, the agriculture industry has been a bright spot. This year's crop is up 11% from last year, with projections of record-breaking harvests across the province.
The incredible advances of ag technology, productivity, crop science, irrigation, sophisticated equipment, more effective fertilizers, more effective farming techniques, zero-tillage farming, all of the exciting things that are happening with higher and higher yields.
Jason Kenney's government is anticipating an increase of farming exports to $16.3 billion by 2023, a 43% increase.
The ag industry has to keep moving forward. People have to eat. People need food on their table. There was huge spikes in meat demand and wheat demand, canola oil demand, in different spots.
The plan, 4 new hires to surge into the international market, including Mexico City and Singapore, while working to expand to the United States and Europe.
Work on promotion of Alberta ag products so that people in those areas will know what it is and will be wanting to buy it. They're also going to try to do investment attraction from those foreign markets into Alberta.
The fact that they understand that we need to move our product to market, and the market is not always right here.
The UCP government says they will roll out a new announcement next week. For Bridge City News, I'm Ainsley O'Reilly.
Imagine waking up in constant pain. This is the reality for many in our country, including one Lethbridge woman. This is Chronic Pain Awareness Month, and as Ainsley O'Reilly explains, those who struggle with chronic pain want people to know that they are not alone in their struggles.
Sydney Abels was born with a rare connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. Her pain is unpredictable and constant.
The hardest dislocations are my hip, my shoulder, and my rib. Sometimes when I'm walking or going upstairs, my hip will completely pop out of place and I will fall to the floor. And the hardest part is getting that joint back in place because it causes such excruciating pain, and then your muscles spasm, and then your mind goes into panic mode, and it's very hard to get that joint back into place.
Sydney has lived an extraordinary health journey, having lost 100 pounds in the last 4 years. She works as a nutritionist and focuses on a holistic health approach when it comes to the colossal task of managing her pain.
If I can get up and get out of bed and focus on all the things that I love about my life, the things that I'm grateful for, the positive aspects of my life that I want to focus on, I'm going to be so much happier for that.
She's in a lot of discomfort a lot of the time, but manages to stay positive, manages to stay courteous and polite and pleasant and along those lines. And that's not always the case when people are in pain all the time.
But that's not who they are. That's a small part of who they are, and happens to affect, maybe their physical abilities or maybe mental or cognitive abilities sometimes. But who they are is much wider and bigger than that.
Abel says that she wakes up in the morning with a purpose, a mission to educate others and help the 1 in 5 Canadians who are dealing with chronic pain, just like her.
When I share my journey, people open up to me and tell me about their chronic pain journeys, and they tell me the things that I've shared with my journey that have helped them in their journey, and that gives me meaning every day to get up and go through the pain that I live in. We are not alone, and I think that it's super important for us to not feel alone and to share our stories.
For Bridge City News, I'm Ainsley O'Reilly.
Recapping one of our top news stories, several people were nominated for the Alberta Northern Lights Volunteer Recognition Program, including a local woman in Lethbridge. And a look at weekend weather. A bit of afternoon haze is in the forecast. Overnight, it should be cloudy with a low of 10. And as for Monday, we're looking at lots of sunshine with a high of 22.
I would have to ask, in what world is it building back better to put tons and tons and tons of debt on the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren? In what world is it building back better to completely ignore the energy sector? In what world is it building back better to ignore the agriculture sector and the fact that they feed not only Canada, but the entire world?
Parliament is back in session following the Liberals' throne speech. Now, prior to Parliament being prorogued, there was a committee investigating the We Charity scandal. Will that investigation continue now that MPs are back in Ottawa? To discuss this in more detail is Lethbridge Tory MP Rachel Harder, who joins me now from our nation's capital. Rachel, welcome back to BCN.
Thank you so much, Hal. It's really great to be with you.
Now, will the investigation into the We Charity scandal continue now that MPs are back? What are your thoughts?
Well, I certainly hope so. Canadians deserve answers. There's some really good questions that are being asked with regards to the We Charity and $912 million that was committed from Trudeau to the charity in order to roll out a youth employment program, or a youth volunteer program, I should say. There's a lot of scandal around that, and Canadians rightly deserve answers to those questions that they have. Now, here's the thing, is that Trudeau actually shut down Parliament in August by proroguing it. So it's not a pause button that he hit. It's actually a total cancellation of what was going on prior to that. And so in order for committee to come back and investigate the scandal and the ethics breaches that were undertaken by this prime minister, there has to be a motion passed at committee. And so we'll see. Conservatives are certainly on board. We certainly want to get to the bottom of this. We want answers for Canadians. We'll have to see if the NDP and the Bloc are on board.
How much do you think this has really hurt Trudeau's popularity? Some people refer to him as the Teflon man because nothing really sticks to him. I mean, the Aga Khan, the SNC-Lavalin affair, now We Charity scandal. I mean, he's still quite popular in many parts of Canada. Why do you think that is? Is it the handouts maybe that he's dishing out right now during the pandemic?
Hal, it's a really good question. And, the best I can do is actually turn the question back out there. And that is to say, what is it that this prime minister is doing that, Canadians find so appealing? I'm not entirely sure. I think in the next election, of course, we're going to find out, exactly, was it the handouts that they're attracted to? Is it his good looks, his great hair, supposedly? But at the end of the day, look, I think there's something that needs to be said here, and that is this country deserves leadership with vision. This country deserves a prime minister who will implement a way to come back from the pandemic and the detriment that it has had on our economy. Canadians deserve to know that they have a solid leader at the helm. And right now, I would certainly argue that they don't.
Now, Rachel, with the pandemic still on, are MPs deciding to vote on certain issues via video conferencing or in person? Or is it kind of maybe a hybrid model being used right now?
Yeah, exactly. So right now, there's a hybrid model being used in Parliament. And so there are some MPs who are able to sit in the House of Commons and some who have to log on virtually. The unfortunate thing about this way of doing things, of course, is those MPs that are in rural areas don't actually have strong enough reception to be able to participate. And so they have to leave their ridings and go into urban centers where they can access, broadband or internet that will help them. In addition to that, though, I think we should look at the fact that other parliaments around the world are able to meet in person and they're able to do so safely. In addition to that, here in Canada, we're sending our kids to school and they're wearing masks and they're sitting in close proximity. And we expect them to be able to go and function and be kept safe. Why can't we, as parliamentarians who have been elected by the Canadian public, do the exact same thing?
Now let's circle back to the spending for just a moment here. Canada's deficit is now approaching $380 billion. Our debt is over $1 trillion. As a country, Rachel, we're going to have to start paying back some of the billions of dollars that the Liberals are doling out. I guess it's safe to say that we're not going to be balancing the books anytime soon?
Yeah, Hal, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Trudeau likes to use this phrase that with COVID, we're able to now build back better, he likes to say. I would have to ask, in what world is it building back better to put tons and tons and tons of debt on the shoulders of our children and our grandchildren. In what world is it building back better to completely ignore the energy sector? In what world is it building back better to ignore the agriculture sector and the fact that they feed not only Canada but the entire world? You know, that's not a plan to build Canada back better, to ignore those industries. We need a prime minister who has a plan. We need a prime minister who will take leadership. We need a prime minister who will put measurable steps in place in order to bring back Canada.
Now that the NDP has thrown their support behind many of the Liberal spending initiatives, is it safe to say that we may not be seeing an election anytime soon?
Well, you know, it certainly appears that way, Hal. It would certainly appear that the Liberals have leaned so far to the political left that they have somehow pacified the NDP.
Wow. Newly elected Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says he wants to keep Canada in the Paris Climate Accord, but still wants to support Alberta's energy sector. How is that possible? How do you harmonize the two?
If we're going to move forward in terms of the strides we want to make with regard to caring for the planet and you know, stewarding our environment, we're going to have to rely largely on innovative practices, which means that we're going to have to get industry involved. This really isn't a solution that's going to be built by government. Yes, government can put vision forward, but ultimately it's going to be the women and men in this country who have incredible intellect and the ability to innovate and come up with new technologies that are going to bring us forward. Ultimately, that's what we're going to be relying on in our plan as Conservatives.
Energy East was taken off the table, getting our oil and gas to Eastern Canada back in 2017. Kenny was talking to Erin O'Toole about it and so forth. Now, is the Conservative Party of Canada putting any pressure on the Liberals to potentially bring it back? Or maybe a new Energy East? Many Canadians agree that those in the Maritimes should not be buying Saudi Arabian oil, they should be buying Alberta oil.
Yeah, again, really good point, Hal. You know, we certainly have been pushing for a unifying strategy. So one that would bring Eastern and Western Canada together, one that would celebrate our natural resource sector, and in particular, you know, the production of oil and gas, and of course, you know, getting that to market. Part of that is, you know, being able to utilize that resource right here within our own country. Right now, we are, you know, ignoring this industry under Trudeau. And as a result, then the Prime Minister of Canada is currently supporting regimes like Saudi Arabia, which have an atrocious human rights record and don't have policies in place with regards to protecting the environment. Again, I would beg the question, in what world does that make sense? We have an incredible industry right here within our own country. We have the ability to transport product from east to west. We just need to put the infrastructure in place. The only thing that is required is political will. We certainly haven't seen that from Trudeau, but we certainly have that in our leader, Erin O'Toole.
How should Alberta maybe look at diversifying its economy? We've talked about agriculture in the past, the oil and gas sector. Now, I know Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage is talking about delving into more of the minerals, the potash, the uranium, and so forth. What are your thoughts about how can we really diversify?
Sure, I think it's both. You know, we have natural resources at our fingertips, and we certainly need to continue to develop the ones that we already are. As long as there's a market, which there is, we should be looking for creative ways to access that market in order to sell our product, in order to generate revenue. Because we know, Hal, that at the end of the day, that revenue that comes off of oil and gas development is what pays tens of thousands of workers and makes sure that their families are kept care of. You know, in addition to that, we know that it's that revenue that pays for hospitals and schools and roads and bridges and other important infrastructure. So yes, we should be talking about innovation. We should be talking about creativity. We should be talking about moving forward in other sectors and diversifying our economy. Absolutely, all day long. Let's have that conversation. But let's also be realists and understand the fact that there is a need for energy right now, and that need only grows by day.
Calgary Tory MP Michelle Rempel-Garner has an online petition, E2574, I believe it is, against the Liberals' gun ban, saying it does nothing to address gun crime in our country, but instead penalizes lawful gun owners, especially those on farms and acreages. This is the largest online petition in Canadian history with close to 231,000 signatures. But let me ask you something, Rachel. Will it make a difference? Will this influence Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to not confiscate legally owned property?
Well, certainly a good prime minister would take into account the fact that this petition has been signed by so many Canadians. I mean, after all, Canada is a democracy. I understand that this prime minister would very much like to turn Canada into a socialized nation, or a socialist country, I should say. But the fact of the matter is, we are a parliamentary democracy. And under that system, those Canadians who signed that petition should be taken into account. They should be considered. This prime minister should listen to their voices, should give them weight, and should make changes accordingly.
Now let's discuss the drug crisis going on in our city here in Lethbridge. And now there's a new group calling itself the Lethbridge Overdose Prevention Society, or LOPS, opening up an unsanctioned tent injection site. Now the province says it's illegal. Mayor Spearman says he's willing to work with the province to help find a solution. But you, being an MP, how about in Ottawa? What can Ottawa do to really help with our solution on our drug crisis here?
Well, again, Hal, you're asking a question that overlaps between municipal, provincial, and federal politics. Certainly as member of parliament for Lethbridge, it is my local community, and I am very interested in the issues that impact those who call it home. I've heard concern after concern after concern from residents within Lethbridge who very much want their community restored to a place that is safe, that is secure. They want to be able to go out with their children and invite the parks and the recreational spaces that our city has, which we have so many, and that's amazing. But in order to make that happen, we have to have a community effort that works toward a solution. And I would say the provincial government right now, yes, they shut down Arches, and we know that they did that because there was criminal activity taking place within the organization. So yes, the organization was held to account, as they should be. What the provincial government did, though, in order to actually assist our community, is they set up a mobilized injection site. And so there is still an opportunity for people to access a safe space where they can consume the drug of their choice and where they will be protected from overdose. That's in place. And unfortunately, that has largely been ignored as a positive step within our community. And so, as you can tell, there's really no need for this unsanctioned tent. Those individuals who want to be cared for, who want to access medical attention, which is not offered at the tent, but is offered at the mobilized site, they can do so. Again, ultimately, the goal should be a common one here, and that is the safety and the security, the well-being of the citizens who call Lethbridge home.
We've received word that many Alberta farmers have received record crops this year, and livestock markets are set to reach record highs of $7 billion. What can Ottawa do to help support our farmers here in southwestern Alberta and around the country? As you know, agriculture is big business, which will help our economy to recover from the pandemic.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you asked the question because this is a big area of passion for me. Agriculture is our superpower. As a country, it is our superpower, and certainly in southern Alberta, it is our superpower. We have access to irrigation. We are able to produce such a variety of crops, and then, of course, animals as well. And so out of that, we are contributing in amazing ways to our economy, but also we are feeding our country. And it would be worth also noting that there are only 5 countries around the world that produce more food than they consume. And Canada is one of those 5. If that's not worth celebrating, I don't know what is. I mean, that's just amazing. Those men and women who farm day in and day out, they work incredibly hard to look after our country. That's a sector that deserves to be celebrated and further developed. And again, I was really disappointed in the speech from the throne. The Prime Minister gave, hardly an honorable mention to the industry. Why do we not have an economic plan in place that includes those women and men, in a way that is tangible and by which we can overcome the economic instability that we currently face?
Alberta Health Minister Tyler Shandro has said that he will not make the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory in our province. Now, has there been any talk in Ottawa from the federal government looking at bringing forth potential legislation making it mandatory, or is it more of a provincial jurisdiction?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, the provinces are going to have to make decisions on this. Currently, I'm not sure exactly where the current government at a federal level sits on this. My personal position, however, and certainly the position of my party, is that a vaccine should not be made mandatory, that the freedom of Canadians should be protected. that individuals should be given the opportunity to choose whether or not they will in fact take a vaccination, should it be offered to them.
Now, Rachel, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, has hurt many business owners across the country, including here in our beautiful province of Alberta. A recent survey says 60% of restaurant owners will close their eateries for good if there's another lockdown with a second wave of the virus. How can we better support those business owners?
Again, Hal, an excellent question. I wish you had been in the room with the Prime Minister when he was drafting the throne speech. These are the questions that we would have expected to be answered there. We would have expected that the Prime Minister, after proroguing Parliament and having weeks upon weeks to plan his throne speech, the bare minimum we would expect from him is that he would have a plan for economic recovery. Unfortunately, the only thing that was within that throne speech was one recycled failed promise after another. It was tragedy. It was an absolute tragedy. You would expect the Prime Minister to be able to serve the well-being of Canadians, to be able to put forward a captivating vision, to be able to put measurable steps in front of them, a plan to move forward. Unfortunately, it's Canadians like the ones you've mentioned who have local small businesses, such as restaurants, etc., who are going to be hurt by this Prime Minister's failed policy. At the end of the day, it's really sad. It's really unfortunate because it's those individuals who help keep our local communities vibrant, who provide jobs to other individuals who can support their families then. And unfortunately, they are going to have to close their doors. They are suffering under this Prime Minister's leadership. Very sad.
Lethbridge Conservative MP Rachel Harder, thanks for joining me today from Ottawa.
Thanks, Hal.
Since the outbreak of COVID-19, there have been billions of dollars spent in research and development of a vaccine. But can we trust what's produced? And when it is developed in such a rush, can we really trust the whole process and those who are developing it? Josh Morrison is the co-founder and executive director of One Day Sooner, an organization that advocates on behalf of COVID-19 challenge trial volunteers. Welcome to BCN, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Now, earlier this year, you were looking for volunteers for human trials to find a COVID-19 vaccine. What has the response been like?
Well, so it's been really incredible. So our organization advocates for human challenge volunteers, which is a special type of test for vaccines or treatments that actually involves deliberately exposing people to infection. And so that's unusual, and we haven't been doing that yet, though there are several groups that are developing these trials. So we've had over 36,000 people in 160 countries who've said that they would be interested in being in these human challenge trials, and I'm one of those people.
So what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for each participant?
So no trial has been officially approved yet. So what I'm about to say is a prediction, and it's not, we don't know for sure. But I think the first trials are going to be really restricted of a challenge trial for COVID-19. So the World Health Organization gave some recommendations, and they said that the first trial should have people only who are 18 to 25 and in really excellent health. And I'm actually 35, so that would mean that I wouldn't be able to participate. No, I think based on what the risks are, I think 18 to 40 might be a better idea than 18 to 25, but I would expect that the first of these human challenge trials are probably going to be restricted to 18 to 25 or possibly 18 to 30.
How about human challenge trials involving maybe seniors, people over the age of 65?
So I think that that's unlikely to happen unless, at least at first. I think the world where something like that would happen would be a world where we have very effective treatments and we're testing a vaccine that we think is going to be very effective. And even then, I think it'd be unlikely. And that's because the risks, a disease that has significant risks at any age, and it can kill people at any age. But someone who's, something like age 20 to 30, their chance of dying if they're infected by COVID might be 1 in 15,000, for example. But the risk of someone who's over 80, their risk could be 10%. So the risk goes up exponentially. And so I think that's why it's such a restricted age range. And I do think for the foreseeable future, certainly for the next 6 months, we shouldn't expect to see people older than say 50, certainly older than 60, be in such a challenge trial.
So Josh, once the volunteers have been infected, where do they go to be isolated? Is it at home or maybe a special facility?
No, it's at a special facility, and that's to make sure that no one who hasn't consented to being exposed to infection is getting infected in this trial. So it's in biocontainment facilities that have a very high standard of biosecurity. So there's only a certain number of those facilities that exist throughout the world. Something like 60 of them are in the US, maybe 20 or so in Europe. I believe Canada has 1 or 2 of them that would be suitable for this purpose. So it's going to be a special facility, and that's where the exposure to the infection would take place. It would be in kind of a nasal dropper, kind of like an eye dropper with the virus for your nose, and then you would go right from that to this isolation, where you would be for probably something like 2 to 3 weeks until it was very certain that you were no longer infectious.
How much of a health risk, however, are these volunteers being exposed to?
Well, so I think that what I would say is that it's meaningful, and it's definitely a risk that no one should take lightly, or that no one should, try at home or something like that. But at the same time, it's, by all the data we have is a lower risk than risk that we let people accept in other circumstances. Like, for example, kidney donation, which is about a 1 in 3,300 chance of death, or childbirth, which in the United States is about a 1 in 6,500 chance of death. And so by comparison, like I said, for that young population, that might be 1 in 14,000. And then that's, if you take out the unhealthy people, it would be lower. So there is real uncertainty about COVID, but, by everything that we know, it's the type of risk we let people accept in other circumstances.
To what degree could the human challenge trials potentially speed up the timeline to get a vaccine?
So I think that we have to think about two different vaccines. The first thing to know is that it's going to take some time to set up the human challenge trials. You need to do what's called an infectious dosing study first. So I don't think we'll be testing vaccines before the end of the year, or maybe at the very tail end of this year we might be able to start testing vaccines. Once you can start testing them, you can, from the time you start infecting the person to the time you get a result, could be as little as a month. So you could really learn a lot. And that's not, you need to still test a vaccine in thousands of people so that you can make sure that they're safe. But that early signal of effectiveness could be very helpful and could speed up deployment by months. Now, that's probably not going to be soon enough for the candidates that are already being tested in these enormous phase 3s, like Moderna's or Oxford's or Pfizer's. But for other things like Merck's or Johnson & Johnson, or all of the more than 100 vaccines that are in development, challenge trials could be crucial to getting that second generation of vaccines that will hopefully be, instead of maybe 60% effective like the first ones likely to be, might be 80 or 90% effective, or might not require a booster shot, might be easier to distribute, things like that.
Now, part of the debate is whether it is ethical to intentionally infect someone with COVID-19. What are your thoughts?
So first, the important thing to know, and something I didn't really know before I started doing this work, is we do these types of infection studies in other contexts. We do infection studies for malaria and flu and RSV, which is another respiratory disease, dengue fever, typhoid, and cholera. So this isn't unique. Now, what is unusual is for most of those diseases, not for flu and not for RSV, but for malaria and typhoid and cholera, we have drug treatments that we can feel confident, once you take that treatment, you're not going to, it's very unlikely to die of malaria, which we don't have yet for COVID. One of the ways this could be useful is helping to test some of those therapies, to get better treatments and therapies. But I think the difference here is that, COVID is more dangerous. But the fact that it's a global pandemic makes the value of this research all the higher. And so, the name of our organization is One Day Sooner, is the idea that right now something like 4,000 to 5,000 people around the world are dying each day of COVID. Now, it's likely that if you did these challenge studies in 1,000 people, no one would die. And if you could even save 1 day of deployment of a vaccine, or end the shortage, or end the crisis 1 day sooner, that represents thousands of lives saved, and that's an enormous benefit for willing volunteers who understand the risks to participate in studies to achieve.
Josh, what really motivates somebody to take this on? They're not being paid. We're talking about volunteering, correct?
So, usually in challenge studies, people do get paid for participation. Most of the volunteers who've signed up, in our study, basically, what we've said is, look, you're going to need reimbursement for lost wages and expenses. You're going to need to make sure that people's long-term health, that there's long-term follow-up and things like that. But that's, that's not people's motivation is to be paid. People have different motivations. Not 36,000 people aren't all going to think the same thing. But I think, what a lot of people say, and that's something that I feel, is a desire to feel empowered to be fighting this virus and to be doing something useful during this terrible pandemic. That's a really strong motivation. And I think people also talk about, wanting to protect their friends and family is another reason people do this. And a lot of people have a deep, or volunteers or people who are part of the medical field or the biomedical field. They know about these studies, they know more about this, and they want to be contributing to science and be part of the solution and not just be passively accepting what's happening.
Let's talk about what's happening in other countries around the world when it comes to a potential vaccine for COVID-19. Josh, Russia's come out in August. They declared that they had approved a vaccine for COVID-19. And in Israel as well, they're talking about some of their labs. They're fairly close as well. Have you had an opportunity to be involved in either of those?
So we definitely haven't been involved. And I would say about the Russian vaccine, it's easy to approve a vaccine if you don't wait to see if it works or not, right? Because there's a number of vaccines that have evidence that they cause an immune response. But we don't know if that immune response is actually going to translate to reduced infection. And we also, you need to test a vaccine in thousands of people to make sure that it's safe before you can really deploy it. And I think those steps are important. And so I do think that, by all accounts, what Russia is doing is misguided and overly hasty. I also think there's been recent indications that some of the data they've been using that have been published, even in very small studies that they've published, or maybe have some issues with them as well. So I do think that, yes, we all want a vaccine, and we certainly want a vaccine soon, but we want something that has really strong scientific evidence and that we can feel confident in giving to the public.
Can you explain how the process actually works as well? Developed in the lab, and then when you go to trials, do you start off with mice, maybe make your way up to pigs, monkeys, before you make your way to human beings? How does that work?
Yeah, so usually, I'll first kind of start with the way things usually work, and then how things are maybe a little different for COVID because of the urgency. So usually you would test a vaccine in what's called an animal model. So in a chimpanzee, I think lately the best animal model for COVID in some ways is actually supposed to be Syrian hamsters, apparently. So usually you test in the animal, then you could do what's called an animal challenge. So you give the virus to the animal and after giving the vaccine. And then if that looks like it works, you test maybe in 30 or 40 people in what's called a phase 1 study to make sure, that any huge safety issues that you can spot that right away. And if that looks good, you expand out to maybe 100 people or so, maybe a bit more, in a phase 2 study, which is testing both that level of safety in a different population, maybe testing a couple different doses, and then also is testing for what's called immunogenicity. Does it generate an immune response? And then finally, if that all looks good, then you would go to these what's called phase 3 of testing in thousands or tens of thousands of people. And that's both, what you do there is what's called a randomized control trial. You take half your people in the group who are tested, and you give them the vaccine, and you take half and give them a placebo, and then you see, do the people who get the vaccine, do they have fewer infections rather than the placebo? And you just have to wait for people to get infected naturally. And so, you need something like maybe a couple hundred infections throughout your study to have a decent sense of if a vaccine would work if it was going to be about 50% effective. You might need fewer infections if it was less than that. Now, the difference with COVID is these things are moving much faster. So a lot of these vaccines that are being tested, they didn't start with the animal model before they went into humans. They did those two things simultaneously. Or, if you look at the Oxford study, which is the drug that's going to be produced by AstraZeneca, that was the first drug to get into phase 3 studies. So in some ways, they're moving the quickest. And they combined their phase 1 and phase 2 study, and then they also combined a phase 2 and phase 3 study. So these things are kind of compressed and things are moving a lot faster than they normally would.
Josh, some people suggest that intentionally infecting healthy volunteers with low doses of the COVID-19 virus could help create herd immunity, which could then potentially make the pandemic easier to maintain or manage. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so first I'll say that's not our position. That's not what we're trying to accomplish. Our organization is trying to test the drugs and vaccines by doing this. This idea, I generally basically think that trying to deliberately infect people just as a way of getting herd immunity, I would worry about that for two reasons. First, for the safety of the people who are being infected directly, but more importantly, because I don't know if then they would spread it to other people who aren't going to be safe. And of course, anyone who's trying this, I'm sure they would say, well, look, we're going to isolate effectively, but you can't know that. And I think that there are reasons to be making, I think it's good to be thinking of creative solutions, but I also think it's good to be scientifically driven. I think the better way, there's an interesting article in the New England Journal of Medicine recently that talks about how people wearing masks frequently and social distancing might reduce the viral load that the average person who is infected is getting, and might therefore lead to less severe disease. So I would say that generally people should be wearing masks, doing their social distancing. If that means then that the people that are infected are getting lower doses and are more safe, that's a good thing. I would be very skeptical of the idea of deliberately infecting people just so they'd have immunity in the future, in part because we don't know what the immunity is going to look like, how long it's going to last, and what effects it might have. That's actually a good reason to do challenge studies. Is one thing we're working on is to develop a reinfection study to challenge people who've already been infected by the virus, and that can help us understand the immune response better and better guide some of these social policy questions.
Do you work with only certain companies to test their vaccines?
So our organization, again, like I said, there's no studies that have been approved yet to test a vaccine with a challenge study. Oxford has said they're interested in doing challenge studies, though that might just be to create the model to do the infectious dosing study, not necessarily for their own vaccine. Our group advocates on behalf of challenge volunteers. That's our goal. And so, basically what I think challenge volunteers want is to get the most and best vaccines developed and available for people around the world throughout, but regardless of what country they're a part of or how much they earn or anything like that. And so, we want to be helping any vaccine developer that could find this useful. So we do collaborate and discuss some of these things with particular manufacturers or trialists. We've had discussion, we have collaborative discussions with Oxford, like I mentioned, but also with the NIH and Johnson & Johnson. But we're definitely willing to work with any group that's developing vaccines to try to get great and effective and useful challenge studies to move things forward as quickly as possible.
Josh Morrison, co-founder and executive director of One Day Sooner. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you.
Artificial intelligence is a big part of our society. You see the new technology in our phones, hospitals, our vehicles, in so many industries. To talk more about it is Dr. Jeff Zweerink. He's an astrophysicist and a senior research scholar with Reasons to Believe. It's an organization which combines science together with faith, and he joins me via Skype from Los Angeles. Jeff, welcome back to BCN.
It's good to be here. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Now, give me a brief description about the ladder of causation. Now, this helps identify the key steps for an artificial narrow intelligence to move into an artificial general intelligence. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking artificial intelligence, growing up when I did, this is the HALs, the R2D2s, the things that are sentient, aware of who you are, aware of who they are, and kind of interact in the world. And we've got a lot of AI out there right now, which is this kind of narrow intelligence, which can play a game of chess or figure out what you're saying and ask you or order pizza online for you. And so, but the difference between those are very dramatic, because what all of the AI that we have now basically maps this set of inputs to this set of outputs. And so it's a very basically correlative way of looking at things. It's like, I see this, therefore that means this. And so there's this kind of seeing aspect to it. But if you want to get to what humans do, or that artificial general intelligence, you got to move up to the next higher rung, which is not just seeing the correlations, but actually intervening to make something happen. So, say I want to build a pool in my backyard. I can have it look and say, all right, these are the kinds of pools you could put in there. That would be a correlation type thing. But an intervention would be, say, what happens if I remove a wall from the house? Or what if I take the tree out? And then to move to the next letter of causation, the third rung, it's asking, what if I move from Los Angeles to Canada? How would that impact my building a pool? Because the things that happen in Los Angeles are very different from, Canada when it comes to building a pool. So that's kind of imagining what could be beyond what is already known.
You know, Jeff, I used to have a pool in Southern Ontario, man. The amount of work I had to put in that thing, cleaning it every day. Don't do it. Don't do it. That's all I'm saying. Now, AI such as Siri, Alexa, and even Tesla cars are almost eerie in how they respond and interact with us. What rung do these fall on, and how much does AI actually anticipate versus respond to our requests?
Well, all of the AI that's out there that I'm aware of is kind of on that first rung of causation, that they're looking at, again, mapping inputs to outputs. So they're seeing this, and therefore that means this. And there's some algorithm for how they choose between different options, but it's seeing this and correlating with that. So all of the AI that we have is at that level. But what you notice is that it's remarkable how it looks like they're doing something more. You know, it looks like they're anticipating, but in reality, what they're doing is saying, okay, given this input, very complicated algorithm and process of mapping it to an output, but nonetheless, it's just this correlation. Input goes to that output.
You know, I want to talk to you a bit about some concerns I know people have with when it comes to autonomous vehicles. What happens if somebody was to hack into the computer, the system, and actually kidnap somebody, change their whole course, or maybe cause the brakes to fail? I mean, there's so many things can happen if technology fails or if somebody hacks into the system.
No, that's actually a very good point. I mean, you know, when it comes to AI, it is one of these really powerful tools. It can do great goods. It can spot diseases and bad or spots on x-rays far better than people can. It's got that sort of capacity. But the more powerful the tool, the greater good you can do with it, but also the greater damage you can do with it. And so that really calls us as humans to make sure that as we're developing this, we don't just look at the technological side. We also have to look at the ethical and moral side. How do we deal with this powerful tool so that the damage is not caused, but we're actually using it for good?
Now, what are some of the myths or misconceptions associated with artificial intelligence?
I think one of the things that plays out often in that is that we see artificial intelligence, and you mentioned Alexa and Siri, and how it's like they're anticipating and they're learning, and we hear those words and we think very humanly about those. That when I'm talking with you, I hear you saying something, and I think, oh, maybe he's going there. I'm actually thinking, okay, where do I fit into this conversation? What's he trying to do? I'm thinking about it a particular way. Whereas Alexa, Siri, all of the AIs that are out there right now, again, they're just saying, all right, these inputs mean these outputs. They're not trying to consider, what are you doing? Where are you going with this? How can I help? It's really just trying to do what it's programmed to do in that sense. And in that sense, while it is learning, it's not like it's saying, we've been talking this way. Maybe it would be better if we talk this way. That would help us get there better. All it's doing is saying, well, I tried this and this was said, no, it didn't work well. So this worked better. So I'm going to go that way. So it learns in that sense, but it doesn't have that higher level cognition or thinking and saying, hey, what's going on? How do I help accomplish this goal better? Because all it is designed is to do is what it's the goal that it's been programmed to deal with.
Now, we've heard that artificial intelligence can learn, but can it think outside of what it's been programmed in to do? Like, can it look ahead and imagine, or maybe backwards to reflect on what might have been? Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a subtle question, because often, I'll give a little bit more concrete example. I can talk about learning where a ball goes. And so I could say, I know that if it's going with this speed at this angle, I know it's going to land there. And then I could say, I don't know what happens if it's a different speed and a different angle. But as I grow, I recognize, wait a second, there's a formula I can just plug this into. And so now that I know the formula, I can deal with a whole wide range of situations. But even though I'm being able to, quote unquote, learn what's going on in this situation, it's still the same thing. So that's what the AI is doing. It's taking what is in this general programming and saying, okay, I can work in that realm, which is very different, again, than what humans do. Because, when I go and play chess, I'm looking to win. But I could go halfway through the game. I could say, you know what? This game has been fun trying to win, but now I'm going to see how long can I play the game. There's nothing that an AI will do at this point where I'll go in there and say, you know what, this goal isn't very good. I'm just going to go a different way. Nothing about AI does that at this point.
If you want to play a long game, maybe try Monopoly or even Risk. That's also pretty long too. Now, with the third rung requiring the ability to imagine something that does not already exist, Is there still a possibility that artificial intelligence technology can really advance to that point?
Well, there are people who are developing the mathematics that allows an algorithm or an artificial intelligence to do some of those, not just see, but actually intervene and gather new data to see what might go on, and also to even imagine new scenarios. But the best I understand it at this point is there are aspects that it's going to mimic of human behavior, but it still is not doing it in the way a human does. Because again, what allows the computer to do that, or the AI to do that, is there's just this incredible wealth of data that it can process through and figure out. So it may be able to imagine a new, or get to the place where it says, okay, let's look at an entirely new situation that doesn't exist. Say maybe if I didn't move to California, where would I be today type thing. But it's not going to be able to do that nearly as universally or as generally as humans do, because there's also a relational aspect of the way humans behave. And putting that into a computer, I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes us from a computer. You think of what Spock does, the ultimate logical machine. But ultimately, what we like about Spock is that he behaves rather humanly. He actually engages in a relationship.
Now, even with the vast advances in AI, how does its limitations reveal the uniqueness of humanity?
Well, I think as we begin to think about what is an AGI and how do we get to a general intelligence, what that forces us to do is ask, what is it about humanity that's unique and distinct, and what do we need to do to make a computer do that? It used to be that if we could make, or the thought was, if we could make a computer that could beat humans at chess, that would be a general intelligence, or maybe at poker, or maybe at this. And what we found is that every time we've achieved those goals, we say, all right, we can actually build computers that are far better than humans at chess or any well-defined game, quite honestly, but they still just approach it very differently. We approach it from a thought process, but we also ask, how do we play into this? So when the computer wins the game of chess, it never says, yeah, that was a great game of chess. It doesn't say anything. It just won the game of chess. Whereas I would be very excited if I could beat a grandmaster playing chess, or my team won the Super Bowl. The AI just doesn't think that way. So there is this distinction in how humans are. We're aware of where we stand in the situation, not just accomplishing tasks like an AI would do.
Yeah, you're right. It'll just say game over. Thanks for playing. Now, what might that uniqueness say about us, where or who we come from, and our purpose in this universe?
Well, I think the fact that an AI doesn't think that way, that we do think that way, leads to the idea that perhaps this is not all there is. If we can imagine worlds outside of our universe, maybe there is a world outside our universe. If our ability to perform tasks is important, but we also are driven to relate to people, maybe we're designed to be relational. And I find that fits very comfortably within Christian theistic thought, that God in and of his being is relational. He's created us in his image. Therefore, we are relational. We're emotional beings. We're social beings. We're also engineer type beings. And so we've got this great wealth of who we are, or the attributes that we share that ultimately flow from being made in God's image. The point is to something that's far bigger than what we are. And I think as we get closer to creating an AI, we see that AI will not match us, that it's made in our image. We see that we're also made in somebody else's image.
Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and Bill Gates have expressed concerns in the past about the risk posed by artificial intelligence, perhaps that we may rely on it a little bit too much. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a definite possibility. We seem to, as a people, be driven towards increasing comfort and avoiding hardships and working less. And that tends to lead to giving away things that protect our freedoms and our liberty and our capacity to take care of ourselves and manage new situations. And so the more we become dependent on it, I really do think that's problematic, especially if we're designed to work and be social and conquer and go out and explore this world, which I think, again, that flows out of a Christian worldview.
How about AI potentially taking away people's jobs as well? There's always that concern too.
I think that's somewhat inevitable. And there's a good part and a bad part of that, because there are certain jobs that are dangerous and humans get hurt. And so if we can have AIs do that, but just becomes a lot easier, or you know, if your screwdriver breaks, you may be sad, but you go to the store and buy a new screwdriver. If you break an arm and you can't work, that's a bigger deal. So there are aspects of what an AI can do that will help humanity. Again, we have to be careful that we don't kind of have that Wall-E type approach where we want the AI to do everything so that we can just sit back, play our games, watch TV, and enjoy sodas on the couch. That's not healthy for us.
So how do we ensure the goal of keeping AI's impact on society very beneficial?
I think it's incredibly important that as we're developing the technology, we also need to be equally serious about thinking about the ethical, theological, and philosophical ramifications. And I know there are people who've thought about that, and there are people involved in that conversation, but we seem to be kind of driven by what can we do at this point. And I just want to make sure that we're very intentional about making sure we're thinking about, is this a good idea? Do we really want to do this? What does it say about our place? And might we be doing something that ultimately is detrimental to humanity in the way we're developing AI? I think if we can do that, we can use the power that AI will bring by avoiding the consequences that would come by using it improperly.
Dr. Jeff Zwerig, Senior Research Scholar with Reasons to Believe, thanks for joining me today from Los Angeles.
Enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.